Before we begin tonight's celebration,
please welcome Her Grace, Duchess Margaret Ashford. I wanted to see how people treat those they believe are beneath them. And character always reveals itself in the end.
Make sure the maid stays out of the family photos, my son's fiancée said with a laugh that afternoon. Several people around her smiled. A few even nodded. I simply lowered my eyes and continued arranging the flowers on the reception table. None of them knew who I was. And that was precisely why I had come. My name is Margaret Ashford. I am 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and the Duchess of Ashford. Yet on that warm spring afternoon, standing inside a luxurious country estate just outside Boston, I wore a simple black dress, comfortable shoes, and a white apron. To everyone there, I appeared to be nothing more than hired help. What they revealed when they believed I was beneath them would change everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I never imagined that one family gathering could reveal so much about a person's character. The estate was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across polished marble floors. Fresh roses filled the air with a delicate fragrance. It was exactly the sort of elegant setting my son William deserved. After years of building his business and proving himself as a thoughtful, hard-working man, he had finally found someone he wanted to marry. At least that was what I had believed. William was 34 now. Sometimes I still remembered the little boy who used to run through our gardens with scraped knees and endless questions. Since losing my husband 9 years earlier, William had become my greatest source of pride. He was intelligent, kind, and generous. Perhaps that was why I worried. Kind people often assume everyone else is kind as well. When he first introduced me to Chloe Bennett, she seemed charming enough. Beautiful, polished, confident. She always knew exactly what to say. But over time, small things began to trouble me. Tiny moments. Comments that sounded harmless on the surface. Casual observations about status, wealth, and social connections. Nothing serious enough to accuse her of anything, yet enough to leave a faint shadow in my mind. Then there was her mother, Vanessa. Every conversation somehow drifted toward expensive vacations, private clubs, or the importance of marrying into the right family. William never noticed. Or perhaps he chose not to. Love has a way of softening warning signs until they become nearly invisible. 3 weeks earlier, I had made a decision. I would attend their pre-engagement celebration disguised as a member of the event staff. No titles, no introductions, no security detail, no recognition. I wanted to meet the Bennetts without the influence of my name. I wanted to discover how they treated people who could offer them nothing. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. Through a trusted event coordinator, arrangements were quietly made. Only my personal attorney and longtime house manager knew the truth. Everyone else believed I was simply another temporary employee helping prepare for the gathering. At first, it was almost amusing. Guests walked past me without a second glance. Some smiled politely. Others ignored me completely. I learned more about people in 2 hours wearing an apron than I had learned in years attending formal galas. Then Chloe arrived. She stepped into the ballroom wearing a designer cream-colored dress and carrying herself like someone entering her own kingdom. Her friends surrounded her immediately. Laughter echoed through the room. As I adjusted a floral arrangement near the entrance, I heard her voice. "Honestly," she said, glancing in my direction, "make sure the maid stays out of the family photos. We want them to look elegant." The group laughed. I felt the silence settle inside me. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something colder, something far more useful. I simply adjusted another rose and continued working. Because at that moment, I realized my little test had officially begun. For the next several hours, I became nearly invisible. It is remarkable how quickly people stop seeing you when they believe your role is unimportant. I carried trays of sparkling water through the ballroom. I adjusted centerpieces. I helped direct vendors arriving through the service entrance. Guests moved around me as though I were part of the furniture. Some offered polite smiles. Most did not. Chloe, however, seemed especially comfortable treating staff as though they existed solely for her convenience. Every request came with the expectation of immediate obedience. Every instruction carried the faint edge of superiority. At one point, she handed me her empty glass without even looking in my direction. "Another one," she said casually before returning to her conversation. I accepted the glass and walked away without a word. Years earlier, my husband used to tell me that true character revealed itself in moments when people believed there would be no consequences. Standing there in a simple apron, I found myself thinking about that often. William arrived shortly before sunset. The moment he entered the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence his father once had. Several guests greeted him warmly. Chloe immediately crossed the room to meet him, wrapping her arm around his and smiling brightly. Watching them together, I understood why he loved her. She knew exactly how to present herself. Around William, she appeared thoughtful, gracious, and attentive. Around everyone else, particularly those she considered beneath her, the mask slipped. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice. Just small cracks, tiny moments, sharp comments hidden inside pleasant conversations. Later, while arranging flowers near the terrace doors, I overheard Chloe speaking with her mother. They stood only a few feet away, unaware that I could hear every word. "The engagement party has to be perfect," Vanessa said. "The Ashford name opens doors that most people never even see." Chloe laughed softly. "Trust me, once the wedding happens, everything changes." There was something in her tone that unsettled me. Not excitement, not love, calculation. Vanessa lowered her voice, but the terrace was quiet enough for every word to carry. "You are fortunate, sweetheart. Families like this do not come around often." Chloe smiled. "I know exactly what I am doing." I focused on trimming a rose stem, careful not to react. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps I was hearing only fragments. Yet the uneasiness inside me continued to grow. A little later, another incident caught my attention. One of the younger servers accidentally brushed against a table while carrying a tray. Nothing spilled. No damage was done. Yet Chloe rolled her eyes dramatically. "Honestly," she muttered loudly enough for several guests to hear. "Some people simply are not suited for professional environments." The young woman looked embarrassed. Barely 20 years old, she immediately apologized. Chloe did not acknowledge her. She simply turned away and resumed her conversation. I noticed something then. The young server looked far more shaken than the situation deserved. This was not the first time she had likely been treated that way. I quietly helped her reset the glasses and offered a reassuring smile. She thanked me before hurrying off to continue working. As the evening progressed, I found myself learning far more than I had expected. Every interaction became another piece of a puzzle. Every careless remark revealed another layer. And with each passing hour, I became increasingly certain that my decision to come disguised as a servant had been the right one. The celebration continued well into the evening, and the deeper I blended into the background, the more people revealed about themselves. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom was glowing beneath crystal chandeliers, and soft music drifted through the estate. Guests gathered in small circles, sipping drinks and discussing everything from investments to vacation homes. I moved quietly between tables, refilling water glasses and straightening decorations that had shifted throughout the night. No one paid much attention to me, which was exactly what made the evening so revealing. Several of Chloe's friends had gathered near the terrace overlooking the gardens. Their laughter carried through the open doors. As I passed by with a tray, one of them gestured toward the staff members working nearby. "I could never do that kind of job," she said. "Can you imagine spending your whole life serving other people?" Another woman laughed. "I would lose my mind after one day." Chloe smiled as she joined the conversation. "Some people are comfortable staying exactly where they are. Ambition is not for everyone." The group nodded in agreement. I kept walking without changing my expression. Years ago, my husband and I had built scholarship programs for working families. We had met extraordinary people from every background imaginable. Some of the most honorable individuals I had ever known worked jobs very similar to those being mocked so casually. What troubled me was not ignorance. It was the certainty with which they judged people they knew nothing about. A short while later, I found myself near a hallway leading towards several private meeting rooms. I had been asked to bring fresh coffee to one of the spaces being used by family members. As I approached, I heard familiar voices through a partially open door. Chloe and Vanessa were inside. I paused only long enough to avoid interrupting them. Then I heard my son's name. "William is completely devoted," Vanessa said. "That makes everything easier." Chloe laughed softly. "He trusts me. Honestly, it is almost effortless." Something about the conversation made me stop. Not visibly, not dramatically. I simply stood outside the room holding the coffee tray. "The family reputation alone is worth it," Vanessa continued. "Most people spend their entire lives trying to gain access to those circles." Chloe sounded pleased. "Exactly. Once we are married, opportunities will come naturally." I waited for her to mention love. I waited for her to speak about William himself. Instead, the discussion remained focused on connections, influence, and status. Every sentence seemed to circle back to the advantages that came with the Ashford name. Eventually, footsteps approached the door. I entered calmly, placed the coffee on the table, and left without drawing attention to myself. Neither woman looked at me twice. To them, I was invisible. Yet the words stayed with me long after I returned to the ballroom. Later that night, I watched William speaking with guests near the grand staircase. He looked genuinely happy. He believed he was surrounded by people celebrating his future. Looking at him, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. He was a good man, perhaps too good, and for the first time since arriving at the estate, I began to wonder whether this test would reveal something far more serious than simple arrogance. That night, after most of the guests had left, the estate grew quieter. The laughter faded. The music stopped. Staff members began clearing tables and packing decorations into storage containers. I carried a box of unused candles through a side hallway and found myself reflecting on everything I had seen throughout the day. None of it had been dramatic. No single moment would have alarmed William if I described it to him. That was what made it so dangerous. Character is rarely revealed through grand gestures. More often, it appears in the small choices people believe no one notices. I finished organizing supplies and stepped outside onto a stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The air was cool and carried the scent of roses from the flower beds below. For a few minutes, I simply stood there, watching the lights glow through the ballroom windows. It reminded me of another evening many years earlier. My husband and I had attended a charity event shortly after our engagement. We were both young then. Neither of us possessed titles or influence. We had very little money. During that event, an elderly waiter accidentally dropped a tray of glasses. The room fell silent. Several guests looked embarrassed for him. My husband had immediately knelt beside the man and helped gather the broken pieces. Later that night, he told me something I never forgot. He said that the way people treat those who cannot benefit them reveals more truth than any conversation ever could. Standing there on the terrace, I realized how often those words had proven correct. The next morning, I returned to the estate before sunrise. My role as a staff member continued. Deliveries arrived throughout the morning. Florists adjusted arrangements. Event planners reviewed schedules. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet I found myself paying closer attention than before. Shortly after 10 o'clock, I noticed Chloe speaking with one of the event coordinators. The young woman was explaining a minor scheduling issue involving transportation for several vendors. It was a routine problem. One that could easily be solved. Before the coordinator finished speaking, Chloe interrupted her. "I do not want excuses," she said sharply. "I want results." The coordinator apologized and assured her the matter would be handled. Chloe walked away without another word. The young woman remained standing there for a moment, visibly uncomfortable. I recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone trying very hard to remain professional after being treated unfairly. Later that afternoon, another conversation caught my attention. Chloe and two friends were discussing wedding plans near the outdoor pavilion. One of them asked whether she felt nervous about joining such a prominent family. Chloe laughed. "Nervous? No. Opportunities like this do not come twice." Her friends laughed with her. One asked whether life would change after the wedding. Chloe smiled and glanced toward the estate. Everything changes when you gain access to the right world. Once again, I waited for her to speak about William. Once again, she never did. I said nothing. I revealed nothing. But as I watched her walk away beneath the afternoon sun, I became increasingly certain that the answers I was searching for were beginning to appear. And the picture they formed was not one any mother would want to see. The more I observed, the more I understood that I could not rely on impressions alone. Feelings were not facts. A mother might notice warning signs, but before making any judgment that could affect her son's future, I needed certainty. That afternoon, after leaving the estate, I contacted two people I trusted completely. The first was my attorney, Charles Whitmore, who had served our family for nearly 20 years. The second was Eleanor Price, the manager of the Ashford Foundation and one of the most discreet women I had ever known. Neither of them knew the full reason for my concern, but both understood that when I asked questions, there was usually a good reason behind them. Over the next several days, I continued appearing at the estate whenever preparations required additional staff. At the same time, Charles quietly reviewed publicly available business records connected to the Bennett family. Nothing improper, nothing invasive, simply information anyone could legally access. Eleanor, meanwhile, spoke with several vendors and event planners who had worked with Chloe during previous events. I expected very little. What I received instead was a collection of small details that painted a troubling picture. No single piece of information was devastating on its own. Yet together they revealed a pattern. Several planners described Chloe as charming when speaking with wealthy clients and influential guests. The same people described an entirely different personality when dealing with employees, assistants, and service workers. One florist recalled being reduced to tears after a wedding consultation. A caterer remembered Chloe demanding expensive last-minute changes and refusing to accept responsibility for additional costs. Another coordinator described Vanessa in similar terms. Reading the notes Charles compiled, I felt a growing sadness settle over me. Not anger, sadness. Because I knew William would excuse much of it if he heard it directly. He would say everyone has bad days. He would say wedding planning creates stress. He would say people deserve understanding. And under normal circumstances, he would be right. But what concerned me was consistency. The stories were remarkably similar despite coming from completely unrelated people. Then Charles discovered something else. The Bennett family presented themselves as considerably wealthier than they actually were. There was nothing illegal about that. Many people enjoyed appearing more successful than reality justified. Yet the contrast was striking. Expensive lifestyles seemed to be supported by substantial debt. Luxury purchases appeared frequently. Financial stability appeared much less often. Again, none of this made Chloe a bad person. Yet combined with her repeated focus on the Ashford name, the picture became increasingly uncomfortable. A few days later, I returned to the estate for another planning session. While arranging place cards near the ballroom entrance, I noticed the young server I had helped earlier in the week. Her name was Emily. She greeted me warmly and offered to assist with several heavy boxes. During a quiet moment, she told me she was working 2 jobs while attending college part-time. She hoped to become a teacher someday. Her eyes brightened when she spoke about her future. There was determination in her voice, gratitude, humility. As we talked, Chloe passed nearby without recognizing either of us. She barely glanced in our direction. I watched Emily continue working with patience and kindness despite receiving little acknowledgement from anyone around her. At that moment, the contrast became impossible to ignore. One woman possessed every social advantage and treated people as stepping stones. The other possessed very little and treated everyone with dignity. And for the first time since this entire test began, I realized that the final answer might arrive sooner than I expected. By the end of that week, I had seen enough to make a decision, but not enough to act. There was one final question I needed answered. People can be impatient. They can be arrogant. They can even be selfish. None of those qualities automatically destroy a relationship. What mattered was whether a person could choose kindness when given the opportunity. I decided to give Chloe that opportunity. The following afternoon, preparations for the engagement gala were underway. Hundreds of guests were expected to attend. Florists moved through the ballroom, carrying fresh arrangements. Caterers reviewed seating charts. Staff members worked carefully to ensure everything appeared flawless. I spent most of the morning assisting with decorations. Around noon, I noticed Emily struggling with several large boxes near the service entrance. Without hesitation, I walked over and helped her move them inside. We finished the task together and shared a brief laugh about how unpredictable event planning could be. A few minutes later, Chloe appeared. She glanced at the boxes, then at Emily. "Why is this taking so long?" she asked. Emily politely explained that a delivery had arrived later than expected. It was a simple explanation. A reasonable one. Chloe folded her arms. Excuses do not solve problems. Emily immediately apologized, even though the delay had not been her fault. I waited. I hoped Chloe might soften. I hoped she might recognize the effort being made on her behalf. Instead, she turned away without acknowledging either of us. Later that afternoon, another opportunity presented itself. One of the floral arrangements near the entrance collapsed when a support stand shifted slightly. Nothing was damaged. The flowers simply needed to be repositioned. Several staff members quickly fixed the issue. Chloe arrived moments later and reacted as though a disaster had occurred. "Do I have to supervise everything myself?" she asked loudly. The room fell silent. No one argued. No one defended themselves. They simply continued working. I watched their faces. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked tired. They had spent days helping create an event that would celebrate her future, yet very few received even basic courtesy in return. As evening approached, I found myself standing alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The sky glowed orange and gold as the sun disappeared behind the trees. For the first time since beginning this test, I felt disappointment settle heavily inside me. Not because Chloe had failed my expectations. Those had already been lowered. I felt disappointed because William deserved better. He deserved someone who valued people for who they were rather than what they could provide. At that moment, my phone vibrated quietly inside my pocket. It was a message from Charles. The final report was complete. I opened the file and slowly reviewed the information. When I finished reading, I stared out across the darkening gardens for a long time. Every remaining question had just been answered. The engagement gala would take place the following evening. 500 guests would attend. Influential families would gather. Reporters would be present. Chloe believed she was about to enter the most important chapter of her life. What she did not know was that the woman she had spent days dismissing as a servant would be standing at the center of the room when the truth finally came to light. The evening of the engagement gala arrived with all the elegance and ceremony one would expect from an event attended by some of the most influential families in the region. Hundreds of guests filled the estate. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. Reporters gathered near the entrance. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, while a string quartet performed near the grand staircase. Every detail had been carefully arranged. Every flower stood perfectly in place. Every table sparkled beneath soft golden light. Earlier that afternoon, I had quietly left the estate and returned to my residence for the first time in days. The simple black dress and white apron were folded neatly and placed aside. My staff helped me prepare for the evening. As they fastened a sapphire necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, I looked at my reflection and thought about everything I had witnessed during the past week. The insults, the assumptions, the casual disregard shown toward people who worked hard every day. None of it had been forgotten. Yet I felt no anger, only clarity. Shortly after 7 o'clock, guests began gathering inside the ballroom for the official welcome. William stood near the stage speaking with business associates and family friends. He looked confident and proud. Chloe remained at the center of attention, moving gracefully from group to group as photographers captured every moment. Vanessa appeared equally pleased. From across the room, I watched them accept compliments and congratulations. Neither of them showed the slightest sign of concern. Why would they? As far as they knew, the servant they had dismissed all week had disappeared. A few minutes later, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. Conversations gradually faded. Glasses were raised. Guests turned their attention toward the front of the room. Then came the moment I had prepared for. The master of ceremonies smiled and adjusted his microphone. "Before we begin tonight's celebration, there is one very special guest whom we would like to recognize." The room grew quiet. "Please join me in welcoming Her Grace, Duchess Margaret Ashford." For a brief second, absolute silence filled the ballroom. Then every head turned toward the entrance. I stepped into the room slowly. The sapphire necklace caught the light. The Ashford family crest shimmered on a small brooch at my shoulder. Several guests immediately stood. Others followed. The reaction spread through the ballroom like a wave. I watched recognition appear on countless faces. Some looked surprised. Others looked relieved. A few smiled knowingly. Then my eyes found Chloe. The color drained from her face. Vanessa looked equally stunned. Neither woman seemed capable of speaking. William stared at me in disbelief before a slow understanding began to appear in his expression. I continued walking toward the stage. The same ballroom. The same people. Yet everything had changed. Days earlier, I had stood among them carrying trays and arranging flowers. Now every conversation had stopped. Every eye was fixed on me. When I reached the stage, I turned and looked across the crowd. Then I looked directly at Chloe. For the first time all week, she truly saw me. The silence inside the ballroom seemed to stretch endlessly. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the musicians had lowered their instruments. Chloe stood frozen near the front of the room. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. Vanessa appeared equally shaken. I did not rush to fill the silence. Some truths deserve a moment to settle. I stepped toward the microphone and offered a polite smile to the guests gathered before me. "Thank you all for being here this evening," I said calmly. My voice carried easily through the ballroom. Over the past week, I have had the privilege of spending time at this estate in a rather unusual capacity. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several guests exchanged knowing glances. Others looked toward Chloe and Vanessa. Many of you may not realize that I attended these preparations disguised as a member of the staff. The whispers grew louder. Chloe lowered her eyes. Vanessa stared at the floor. I continued speaking in the same steady tone. I did so because I wanted to understand something important. Not how people behave in front of wealth, influence, or titles. I wanted to see how they behave when they believe someone has none of those things. The room became quiet once again. William remained motionless, watching me carefully. I could see questions forming behind his eyes. Questions he had never imagined needing to ask. During those days, I met remarkable people. I continued. I met hardworking staff members who treated every guest with dignity. I met young people building their futures through determination and sacrifice. I met individuals whose character shined brightest when nobody was watching. My gaze briefly found Emily standing near the back of the ballroom. She looked startled to be noticed. Then I turned toward Chloe and Vanessa. Unfortunately, I also witnessed something else. Neither woman looked up. I heard conversations about status, about social connections, about opportunities attached to a family name. I observed repeated disrespect toward people whose only mistake was holding jobs that others considered unimportant. No accusation entered my voice. No anger. Only facts. That made them impossible to dismiss. Vanessa suddenly stepped forward. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said nervously. "We never intended." I gently raised one hand. The interruption ended immediately. "Intentions reveal themselves through actions," I replied. "And actions repeated often enough become character." Several guests nodded quietly. The words seemed to land heavily throughout the room. Then I looked directly at my son. "William, this evening is not about punishment. It is not about embarrassment. It is about truth. The people we choose to build our lives with should value others regardless of their position, income, or influence. Anything less eventually reveals itself." William remained silent for several seconds. His eyes moved from me to Chloe and back again. For the first time all evening, Chloe appeared genuinely frightened. Not because her secret had been exposed, but because she could see the certainty growing in William's expression. The certainty that comes when scattered pieces finally form a complete picture. No one spoke for several seconds after my words settled over the room. The silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of surprise. It was the silence that follows understanding. William slowly stepped forward. He did not look at me first. He looked at Chloe. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then he asked a simple question. "Is any of it true?" Chloe opened her mouth, closed it, and tried again. The confidence that had carried her through every social gathering seemed to have disappeared. She spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about being judged unfairly. Yet she never truly answered the question. William listened quietly. The more she spoke, the more his expression changed. I recognized that look because I had seen it once before on his father. It was the expression of someone accepting a difficult truth. Eventually, William turned toward me. "How long?" he asked softly. "A week," I replied. "Long enough to observe. Long enough to listen. Long enough to understand." He nodded slowly. There was disappointment in his eyes, but there was also gratitude. Not because I had exposed anyone, because I had given him the truth before he built the rest of his life upon a false foundation. The evening continued, but not in the way anyone had expected. Guests spoke quietly among themselves. Some approached me to offer their respect. Others simply reflected on what they had witnessed. Chloe and Vanessa remained near the front of the ballroom, increasingly isolated as the reality of the situation settled around them. Yet I felt no satisfaction in their discomfort. Life teaches enough lessons without adding cruelty to them. Before leaving the stage, I asked for the microphone one final time. "There is one more person I would like to recognize tonight," I said. Confused expressions appeared throughout the room. Near the back of the ballroom, Emily looked up from her work. Her eyes widened when I called her name. Slowly, she approached the stage. She looked terrified. "This young woman spent the week working harder than anyone here will ever know," I said. She treated every guest with kindness. She carried herself with dignity, even when others failed to show her the same respect. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Several days ago, I learned that she has been balancing 2 jobs while pursuing her education. Effective immediately, the Ashford Foundation will provide a full scholarship covering the remainder of her studies. Gasps spread through the room. Emily covered her mouth in disbelief. I smiled and squeezed her hand gently. The applause that followed was genuine, warm, earned. Later that evening, as guests slowly departed, William joined me outside on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The night air was cool. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he looked at me and smiled sadly. "Father used to say that titles impress people, but character reveals them." I returned his smile. He was right. William looked back toward the ballroom. Then he looked at the stars above us. "Thank you for showing me the difference." We stood there together in comfortable silence. And as I watched the lights fade inside the estate, I realized something important. Wealth can open doors. Status can attract attention. Titles can command respect. But none of those things reveal who a person truly is. Only character does. And character always reveals itself when someone believes nobody important is watching.